Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is John, and I have another book review for you. I wanted to talk to you about a book that I finished last month in March. And it's a book that I have had sitting on my shelves for probably every bit of 15 years. Probably found at a library book sale. It's the old familiar tale. And it just never got read. But it is a book of little. Well, I'll get into what it is in a second, but it counted for Historathon for me because it was one of the last books that I read for quarter one, which starts at Plank time and goes all the way up through the year 500, which certainly includes Jesus. So I read Jaroslav Pelikan's Jesus Through the Centuries, his place in the history of culture. This is put out by Yale University Press. And Jaroslav Pelikan died in 2006, but he was one of the great ecclesiastical historians of the 20th century. He wrote if you're familiar with his name, you probably know him because he wrote a 5-volume series of books about ecclesiastical history called The Christian Tradition, a history of the development of doctrine, which is, for my money, maybe one of the best series of books that you can get that traces Christian theological history from its earliest forms, the early church fathers, the patristics, all the way up through post-Enlightenment. So it was published throughout the 80s, at the 70s and the 80s. Like I said, was still one of the greatest syntheses of 2 millennia of Christian thought. As a believer in Christianity himself, he was, I don't know what he was early on, but I think that he converted to Orthodoxy in his later life. So he was a Christian, he was a believer, and then he also taught divinity at the University of Chicago and church history at Yale. So he's sort of in a unique position to be able to understand not only the development of theology, but how religious thought interacted with broader culture. Jesus Through the Centuries, his place in the history of culture, was published by Yale University in 1985, and it traces the images of Christ throughout most of Christian history. The word image here doesn't necessarily refer to strict artistic or visual representation, but how the person of Christ has been imagined and how that is interacted with culture. So to cite 3 examples, how this happened, or rather, how Christ was portrayed as an intermediary figure between God and humanity. That was one of the central concerns in Byzantine theology, by the way. Another one is the embrace of how Christ was used to embrace evangelical poverty by the Franciscans, which was seen as both a threat to the Pope and the Emperor alike, which is taken up in the book, and also the speculation we may wish to cast upon the claims of supernatural miracles in the light of modern science and textual criticism, as seen during the Enlightenment and the 19th century, respectively. So this book is not a sustained argument in any sense of the word. It is 18 very short, tightly argued chapters which look at ways in which Jesus has been culturally received, with titles like The Rabbi, Jesus as Teacher of the Jewish Law. There's another one called The Teacher of Common Sense, which looks at the rationalist approach of people like Thomas Jefferson, who looked at Jesus as a moral teacher and an ethical teacher, and sort of divorced what the New Testament had to say from its supernatural or miraculous claims. And there's another chapter called The Poet of the Spirit. I promise I'm not going to go through all 18 chapters. There's another one called The Poet of the Spirit, which looks at Jesus as a conduit between art and artists that allows for the transmission of spiritual and artistic beauty. In each of these chapters, which read sort of like impressionistic essays, you can dip into and out of. So, like I said, not a sustained argument but something you can read little chunks of. Pelikan raises questions, befitting the subtitle, that reach beyond the narrow confines of the religious and touch on broader subjects. For example, at the end of the Rabbi chapter, which I think is the first one, he poses an interesting rhetorical question about a certain counterfactual of Christian history. He asks this, or observes this, quote, "For the question is easier to ask than it is to answer, and it's easier to avoid than it is to ask in the first place. But ask it we must. Would there have been such anti-Semitism? Would there have been so many pogroms? Would there have been an Auschwitz if every Christian church and every Christian home had focused its devotion on icons of Mary, not only as Mother of God and Queen of Heaven, but as the Jewish maiden and the new Miriam, and on icons of Christ not only as Pantocrator and the Rabbi Joshua Bar Joseph, Rabbi Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, in the context of the history of a suffering Israel and a suffering humanity." So basically what he's getting at there is, when we have so much history, specifically so much anti-Semitism, especially in the history of Christian thought and theology, if we had done a better job at situating Christ as a specifically Jewish figure. And it's an interesting question to ask. But he raises questions like that all throughout the book. It's not a book trying to ask how could history or culture have been different, but he does make these sort of piquant observations with really... It's a shame that, we have figures like Martin Luther, who, for everything he did for the Reformation, really, the anti-Semitism thing is just really, really unfortunate. And he is one of the bigger perpetrators of it. Certainly not the only one. But how could Christian history have been different? How could Christian thought have been different if we had been better at making the figure of Jesus a specifically Jewish one, emphasizing that Judaism? Because of the short vignette-like nature of the chapters, the arguments here aren't subject to really deep analysis that you're more likely to find in Pelikan's other books, specifically the 5-volume history of Christianity that I mentioned at the top of the video. If anything, the cumulative argument here, to the extent that there is one, is very much like the one Albert Schweitzer makes in his book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus. Basically, it's that every age has laid new claims to Jesus in a way that doesn't so much echo the theology or the moral teaching of the Gospels, but rather reflects the sentiments of the age itself. And today, we see, that the arrow of influence goes both ways. The church and church teaching doesn't just influence culture, but culture also interpenetrates the church. And I think it's a good idea to appreciate that sort of duality of influence, the bidirectionality of that arrow, instead of just thinking that one always influences the other. But that's about all I have to say about Jaroslav Pelikan, at least this book. I really do need to talk about the 5-volume, but I mean, they are fantastic if you're interested in sort of a one-stop shop for Christian theology. Jaroslav Pelikan's Jesus Through the Centuries, His Place in the History of Culture. I will see you soon with another video. Bye.